Okay, let's see if we can get through chapter 4 in 10 minutes or so, because I think Zoom kind of cuts you off after that. So, anyway, chapter 4 is dealing with growth, diversity, and conflict in the colonies from the early 18th century to the end of the French and Indian War. So, this is the second part of what's going to be in period 2. So, anyway, let's go through and see what's going on. Okay. So one of the things that you need to keep in mind about New England, particularly since we're looking at how the colonies were developing, is that in New England, women, men did a lot of work together. Women were subordinate in the sense that they were expected to basically play second fiddle to the man. They had their hands full. Okay, they had a high fertility rate, and so they were keeping house and raising kids and working with the farm. Uh, the way that inheritance worked in New England is that children usually received land, okay, upon marriage. It was getting very, very hard for people to find land in New England because it's a very narrow area. And so consequently, some of the wealthier people were getting wealthier, poor people were struggling. Another thing about inheritance in New England is that women, once they married, the property that they possessed, their husbands now owned it. Farmers, we're having a hard time in New England because there's more people coming over and there's less and less land. Uh, for instance, they started to turn towards raising livestock in New England because it was more profitable, but it also caused the land to become more deteriorated because of erosion, overgrazing. So, they couldn't win. So, most of the wealth in New England was centered around trade, commerce, shipbuilding, and then later, once industrialization started, with factories. Uh, in the middle colonies, there was a lot more opportunity, okay, for people. Uh, New York was really more of an aristocratic type colony during this time period, and so it was not really to the 1800s that a lot of the rules that kept people from owning a lot of land were lifted. So tenant farmers were not in good shape there. But in areas where the Quakers settled, like in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, it was very open for people to come in and settle. The Quakers had a very open, unrestricted policy towards immigration. And so the result is that you had an extremely diverse group of people coming into the middle colonies. Large numbers of Germans, okay, largely seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity, and the Scots Irish who were immigrating, largely because of a depressed economy in Northern Ireland. The textile industry had collapsed, and so these people were leaving. And so, besides the English and African Americans, the next largest group of people in the colonies were the Scots Irish. So, um, most of these Scots Irish didn't settle on the frontier, and so very quickly Pennsylvania was becoming more of a German, uh, Scots Irish, Protestant, Catholic, not very much Quaker colony. And so as these people moved westwards, um, the good relationships that Pennsylvania had previously with Native Americans began to deteriorate. Um, there's two things that you need to know about culture in the colonies that develop that are significant. One is the Enlightenment, okay, which was an intellectual movement that started in Europe. The other is Pietism, which is a religious movement that emphasizes more of the moral and personal nature of spirituality. Um, there was a revolution in print in the colonies in this time period. Roads are starting to improve, but there's now more of an opportunity for people to get information from the outside world. And as these roads improved, taverns and pubs were built along them, natural places for the dissemination of information. So with the Enlightenment, the stress of reasoning, we talked about this in previous years, but John Locke was very influential with the idea of natural rights, the idea of social contract, that governments are created by people willingly giving some of their liberty to the government in return for the government protecting their natural rights. You know, it also gave rise to a new religion or a new approach to religion called deism. The idea of that God was not a personal God, but created things, and just like a clockmaker setting a clock in motion and then leaves the room, God's like that. So God is not intimate with His creation. Many of our founding fathers were deists. They believed in God, but they didn't really think that God interfered with the world. Like it says here, God created the world and stepped back. So that was an Enlightenment idea. Uh, the pietism that was also around in this time period gave rise to a religious movement called the Great Awakening, which was a revival movement. And this changed the landscape in the colonies. Started in New England with preaching that wanted to get people out of the rut and start to approach God and spirituality from a more personal perspective. And so these people were very inspired speakers. They were wonderful preachers. They captured people's imaginations, and this became a colony-wide event. Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield traveled, preached, and the result is that everybody in the colonies were connected by this movement, and it started to set in motion some of the religious diversity that we have today. Um, you have the new lights, the people that embrace the Great Awakening and the idea of conversion and the idea of this emotional approach to religion, and the old lights who kind of wanted to keep things the same. And, they fought against it. So, you have this undermining of church authority. People began to question it. People began to go off and build their own churches and do their own things. They started to develop their own university systems. You started to see, people challenge things that traditionally weren't challenged. And so this sets in motion these ideas that are going to give root to revolution, like town meetings is an example of democracy, or churches that vote to elect their ministers. That's leaning towards democracy. A lot of Baptists were created during this time period. In fact, the Baptist Church starts to become one of the major beneficiaries of this movement. Traditionally, they were more marginalized, and now they're moving to the forefront. They really didn't like the Church of England in many places, and so they didn't like the fact they had to pay taxes to the Church of England, and that led to conflict. And so the idea of this concept of religious diversity in this country, the idea of separation of church and state, really has its roots with all these things that are going on within the Great Awakening. So the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening are two events that really shaped colonial culture and identity. Major conflict that shaped things was the French and Indian War. It started over disputes between the French and the British over the Ohio River Valley. George Washington actually gets the credit for starting this war, which becomes a global conflict. And in Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. There was an attempt at colonial unity during this war called the Albany Congress. The idea is to keep the Native Americans on the side of the British, not the French. And so this idea of joining together, there's a cartoon that shows a snake cut into pieces with the names of the colonies on them. That's a political cartoon by Benjamin Franklin. Both the colonial assemblies and the British government didn't like it, but the idea, though, that there could be cultural unity was very strong, and people would look back to this. You have the idea of war hawks, the people who wanted war. They wanted to see this happen. You see this particularly in like the War of 1812 in Vietnam, where people are really strongly advocating aggressive military action of their foreign policy. So you had some of this going on with the French and Indian War. There was a problem during this war because the British didn't really think the colonists would step up and do their job. They tended to look down on colonists, and the British tended to be disdainful, or the colonists were disdainful of the British. Um, this was a tremendous conflict. It was very expensive, and Britain comes out on top, but at a pretty high price. I mean, they were heavily in debt. France was pretty much effectively booted from North America at this time period. One of the negative consequences for Native Americans is now there wasn't another European group to play one against the other. Okay, so they that led to increased tensions between the British and between the Native Americans, or the British colonists and the Native Americans. There was a large uprising called Pontiac's Rebellion that resulted in the British saying, okay, we're not going to have any more westward movement until we can solve some territorial disputes with Native Americans. That's called the Proclamation Line of 1763. Britain in this time period is growing industrially, and they're using the resources from the colonies, and the colonies are growing, and they're buying a lot of stuff from the British. Um, they're growing economically, they're growing in population, and so people are starting to move westward. Um, so more farmers, more people are starting to go over the mountains, and this is going to become a problem. In the western part of a lot of colonies, you have people that were very disdainful of the people in the eastern parts, people that were aristocrats. And so these, you have some examples of like the Paxton Boys and the South Carolina Regulators are people that want more land, they want more representation in government, they want less concessions given to Native Americans. This is going to lead to some problems in the with the American Revolution as you start to see these splits between the elites and common people. So know some things about the different divisions in the colonies. In the middle colonies, there's a lot more ethnic diversity, religious diversity. Know something about the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening and how that impacted these areas. And definitely know something about the French and Indian War and how that's changing not only the relationship of Native Americans with the British colonists, but also the British colonists with Great Britain. Okay, so that's it, and thank you. And if you have any questions, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you the next time.